evening, everyone, and welcome to the EthiQal HPCSA Booklet number 9, EthiQal Record Keeping in the Digital Age webinar. My name is Amy Wolf, and I will be your host tonight. We have a full program, so let's get started. I'm just going to share my slide deck quickly. So from a disclaimer perspective, this webinar is a conversation between stakeholders. It does not constitute legal advice. We are sharing our perspectives, and the case studies are all fictional. Any resemblance to actual cases is purely coincidental. For those of you who have just joined us and missed the introductory video, just some general housekeeping pointers. So questions can be raised during the Q&A function, as well as in the chat. In the Q&A function, you can post questions anonymously. In the chat, we'll be able to see who you are. There will be a series of multiple choice questions that are raised. Your answers are all anonymous. If you're joining via the browser on your mobile, you will need to either put your answers in the chat or log on via the Zoom app to vote. If you attend the full webinar, you will get 2 ethics points. Your CPD certificates will be sent within 4 weeks, and there will be a video recording available from Wednesday, the 15th of October. For those of you whose colleagues potentially want to watch it afterwards, they'll be able to collect points for a full year after the webinar. I'd like to welcome tonight's subject matter experts who will form part of our faculty and panel. First is Dr. Simon Strawn. He's a practicing pediatrician at the Life Bedford Gardens Hospital in Johannesburg. He serves as the CEO of the South African Private Practitioners Forum, representing over 4,500 specialists who are in private practice. Under his leadership, the SAPPF actively engages in healthcare policy discussions, striving to improve the quality and accessibility of healthcare for all South Africans. He is also a steering committee member of the Universal Healthcare Access Coalition that advocates for practical solutions to achieve universal health coverage for all South Africans. Dr. Shlombi Makaluma is a general medical practitioner with a master's in medical law and ethics. He's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria and is studying towards his PhD in medical law. At EthiQal, he provides medical legal advice on various issues affecting the doctor, from general advice through to claims, notifications, and complaints. He is also the interface between the doctor and the legal and risk management teams. Alison Matham. Alison started her career as a nurse before obtaining her BCom and MBA degrees. She spent 12 years at Ernst & Young before establishing Visibility in 2012. Her passion is finding practical solutions to complex problems and making business management accessible for all healthcare practitioners. At Visibility, she leads a team of highly competent individuals and assists clients finding their way to success, regardless of what stage they are in their business. To date, Alison and her team at Visibility have supported more than 350 specialists to establish practices across 50 hospitals in South Africa. Dominic White. Dominic is a longtime hacker and cybersecurity researcher, and more recently a business leader. He is the ethical hacking director at Orange Cyber Defense and runs a South African business. Starting in security 20 years ago, his focus has always been on how attack informs defense. And then Jamie Lee Kruger. Jamie Lee completed her LLB degree at the University of KZN. She worked at Westville Correctional Services as a teacher as part of her practical legal training module, and went on to commence her candidate legal experience practicing in conveyancing and wills and estates. Jamie Lee continued her candidacy with Everingham Attorneys, where she is currently practicing as an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa. She provides legal assistance on a wide range of commercial and insurance disputes and has a particular interest in medical legal malpractice and general liability claims. So now we want to find out a little bit more about you as an audience. So I'd like you to participate in some introductory questions. They are all multiple choice. There are no right or wrong answers. These will come up one by one on your screen, and you'll be able to vote anonymously if you are joining us either on the app on your phone, or if you are joining on your laptop or your iPad or your desktop. If you are joining on your phone through your internet browser, you'll need to put your answers in the chat. So let's get started. I'm going to read through these one by one, and then the poll will come up. So the first question is, we'd like to know, who are you? So I am a medical student, a GP, an allied health professional, a specialist, or a practice support staff member or other. Marcel, can you please put up question number 1 for the audience? All right, you can vote now. I'll give you a few seconds to vote. All right, so who are you? Are you a student? Are you a GP? Are you an allied healthcare professional? Are you a specialist? Are you a practice support staff member, or do you fall into the other category? Okay, I'm seeing some comments coming through on the chat, which is perfectly fine. Thank you so much. All right, Marcel, can you close this poll for us, please, so we can see who the audience is? All right. So interestingly, the majority of our audience is specialists, but we also have good representation in GPs, allied health, and the other category. All right. Second question. I have been in practice for less than a year, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years, more than 15 years, or other. Marcel, if you put up question number 2 for us. Thank you very much. So I have been in practice for. Choose the option that best aligns with you. Give you a few more seconds. I can see some comments coming through in the chat. That's perfectly fine. Thank you for participating in the way that you can. Great. All right. So the majority of the group tonight are have been in practice for more than 15 years. Wonderful. And then we have a good spread amongst the rest of the options. All right. Question number 3, I work in the private sector, the public sector, both the private and public sector or other. If you'll let us know, Marcel, please can you put up the poll? Thank you so much. So I work in private sector, public sector, both private and public or other. Great, I can see some of you answering in the chat. That's wonderful. Okay, I work in, and lovely to see members of the audience still joining us. If you're joining us, welcome. Okay, so the majority are working in the private sector. Great to know, but we also have some that work in both or the public sector. Okay, question number 4. My practice is paper-based, transitioning from paper to electronic records, fully electronic record-based, or a mix of paper-based and electronic records. Marcel, if you can put up the poll, please. All right. We'd like to know what is happening in your practice from a record-keeping perspective. Wonderful. I can see some of you posting in the chat. That's great. For those of you who can vote, we love your answers in the poll as well. Give you a few more seconds. Okay, great. We're seeing some more answers coming through in the chat. Okay, Marcel, if you'll close the poll for us, please. Okay, so we've still got quite a group who are using paper-based. Some are transitioning, some are fully electronic, and then there are some that are using a mix of paper-based and electronic. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Okay, and then last question. Cybersecurity risk scares me. It's something I'm actively working to manage. It's something I'm not aware of, something I want to learn more about, or I have already been hacked. And you can choose more than one here. Marcel, thank you very much. So you can choose as many options as are applicable here. Lovely, I can see the chats coming through. Okay, welcome to those of you who've just joined the session. If you're not seeing the poll coming up on your phone, if you're joining on your phone, please feel free to put your answers in the chat. For those of you who are seeing the poll, you're welcome to answer anonymously. All right, Marcel, if you'll close for us, please. Okay. All right, so there's a lot of curiosity about it, which is wonderful. Okay, there's some of you who are quite fearful about it, and it's something that you're working actively to engage, something that you're not aware of. So we have some newbies here and also some people that have been hacked. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. This was so informative for us and really helps us orientate within the group. So what we're going to do now is we are going to go across to our first case study. Shlumbi, can I ask you to take yourself off mute and please introduce us to the case study?
Thank you, Amy. And Good evening, everyone. First study. Dr. B retires, emigrates, and sells his practice and patient records to a Dr. C, who informs patients only via reception desk sign on the day of the takeover. Dr. C comes in, puts up a sign and says, look, I'm the new person in here now. One of Dr. B's patients, Miss X, is uncomfortable with the abrupt change and seeks care elsewhere. She requests her records from Dr. C, who hesitates to release these records, viewing them as part of the purchased assets, and delays the process of releasing them and requests Miss X to rather maybe continue receiving your treatment from me until such time that those records I can be able to release them to you, Miss X. Miss X contacts Dr. B, who's already out of town, requesting an urgent refill of a Schedule 5 medication. Dr. B emails a handwritten, scanned prescription, which the pharmacist rejects for not meeting legal standard. Miss X is left without medication and is frustrated and reports both doctors to the HPCSA because of this communication, lack of access to records, and inability to get her necessary medication. That's the first case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shlombe. All right, so for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are going to put up a series of poll questions to find out what you know as an audience. So I'm going to read out question 1. We're going to put up a poll and then you can vote. So regarding notifications of selling or transferring a practice to another practitioner, what are the ethical and professional responsibilities of Dr. B to patients? A, Dr. B must give patients a 3-month notice in writing and give patients the option to remain with the new practitioner or seek alternative care. B, Dr. B must only inform those patients who are currently receiving treatment. Other patients should receive information from Dr. C on their next visit. C, the sales agreement between Dr. B and Dr. C stipulates that Dr. C will inform patients. Dr. B has no responsibility to do so. And D, Dr. B must inform the patients, however, that he must encourage them to remain with the practice under Dr. C, as this will enhance continuity of care. Marcel, can you please put up case study 1, question 1 for us? All right, so for those of you who've just joined us and can vote, your answers are all anonymous on the poll. So if you can vote and you're seeing the poll popping up, please vote. If you are unable to because you're joining from your phone using your browser, please put your answer in the chat. And A, B, C, or D is perfectly fine. We just want to get a feel for what you know at this point. So I'll give you a few more seconds to choose the answer. All right. All right. Give it a try, even if you're not sure. Gives us an indication of where we need to focus as a faculty. Okay, Marcel, if you can please close the poll for us so we can see. Okay, so the correct answer is A, and what's wonderful is to see that 70% of our audience have voted A. All right, let's go to the next question. All right, what is the correct procedure when a patient requests his or her medical records? Who has ownership of the records? Can a practitioner refuse the release of records to patients? So the options are A, Dr. C must only release the records only if the patient provides proof of intent to transfer to another doctor, not to take them to lawyers. Otherwise, he can delay releasing them. B, Dr. C must provide the patient with copies upon request within a reasonable time and may charge a reasonable copying fee. C, Dr. C is not required to release any records as both the documents and the information belong entirely to the practitioner. And D, Ms. X may demand the original records at any time since both the physical documents and the information belong to her. Marcel, case study 1, question 2, please. All right, so we'll let you vote. For those of you who can vote, we'd love to hear your feedback, which option you think is correct. All the answers are anonymous, so even if you're not sure, give it a try. And if the poll doesn't pop up on your screen, feel free to pop your answer in the chat. We'll give you a few more seconds to answer the question. All right, we're seeing some lovely responses coming through. Welcome to those of you who have just joined us. Okay, Marcel, if you can please close the poll for us. All right, and the correct answer is B, which 75% of the voting audience got correct. So well done. He must provide copies to the patient within a reasonable time and may charge a reasonable fee. Okay, question number 3. Was Dr. B's action of emailing a scanned prescription for a Schedule 5 medication legally compliant? And what are the potential medical legal implications of this conduct? If not, what should he have done? A scanned or emailed prescription is acceptable for Schedule 5 medications if it clearly shows the practitioner's details and signature. B, a scanned prescription is invalid, but a practitioner may ask the pharmacist to dispense based on a phone call without providing the original document afterwards. C, while a scanned prescription is invalid, Dr. B may email it to the pharmacist with the words handwritten as original script in inverted commas. D, a Schedule 5 prescription may be an original handwritten and signed document. The correct procedure is to issue an original prescription and ensure the patient takes it to the pharmacy for dispensing. Marcel, question 3 for case study 1, please. Right. If you're seeing the poll, we'd love to hear your answer. Remember, your answers are all anonymous. So even if you're not sure, give it a try. I can see some lovely comments coming through in the chat. Thank you for interacting in the way that you can. All right, we'll give you a few more seconds. All right, Marcel, if you'll close the chat for us, please, the poll. All right, so the correct answer is D. And we're seeing that 68% of the audience got that correct. Well done. Okay, so it must be original, it must be handwritten, and it must be a signed document. All right, last question. From the perspective of the HPCSA, what ethical principles and guidelines are most relevant in adjudicating Ms. X's complaint about the transition and record access? A, the HPCSA would primarily consider whether Dr. B or Dr. C acted in their own financial interest, since ethical guidelines are secondary to the business needs and ownership rights. B, the HPCSA only evaluates whether practitioner complied with the technical wording of the ethical guidelines only, without reference to the broader ethical duties or patient rights. C, the HPCSA would apply principles of patient autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, as well as continuity of care, informed consent, confidentiality, and patients' rights of access to their records. Or D, the HPCSA will consider only ownership of records related matters to adjudicate. Confidentiality and privacy matters would not be considered. Marcel, question 4 for case study 1, please. Thank you so much. Right, I'm seeing some answers coming through in the chat. Thank you so much for engaging. And lovely to see some of you joining us a little bit later this evening. We are currently doing a case study. So if you'd like to guess an answer, if you're seeing the poll on your screen, please do so. You're welcome to put an answer in the chat as well. All right, a few more seconds here, and then we'll ask you to close, Marcel. All right, Marcel, if you'll close for us, please. All right, amazing. 91% of you got this correct, so it is option C. Okay, fabulous. Okay, I am now going to invite Jamie Lee to share her screen so she can give us an introduction from a legal perspective. And Jamie, when you're ready.
Great. Good evening, everyone. The focus of the session today is just to give you a bit of a concise reminder on the contents of the HPCSA Booklet 9, but also to highlight certain areas where we've identified that healthcare practitioners most often run into ethical and legal difficulties. So I just want to touch on an overview on certain areas which are discussed in the booklet, which I find are important to the context of our discussion today. Looking at the content of health records. So the content is not only confined to the findings of clinical assessments and the notes that are made in that regard, or the findings of special investigation reports, but the content of the record also needs to include information and notes on any interactions that are relevant to the patient's treatment. So this would also include any notes on virtual or telephonic discussions with the patient, or any discussions that you would have with colleagues about the patient's management. The manner in which the health record is also created is quite important. So not only is the content important, but the manner in which it is created. So patient records must be comprehensive, they must be accurate, clear, legible, and made and updated in real time. Another important consideration is confidentiality. So records, whether electronic or paper-based, they must be kept confidential. So they must be safely stored and also only accessible by authorized individuals. This is essentially to prevent any unauthorized access to confidential information, also to avoid any alteration to the documents or any loss to the documents that you have. An important consideration here is also the protection of personal information. So it comes into play because it broadens the scope, as in confidentiality is not only confined to the medical information that's stored of the patient, but also to their personal information. For example, disclosing the patient's identity and confirming that they are actually a patient of yours in itself is confidential information that we would also try to keep private. We then also look at the retention periods that are touched on in the booklet. So the guidelines state in an ideal setting that records can be kept indefinitely, but we know from a practical perspective that it's not always possible. So in general, the records must be kept for at least 6 years from the date when the management of the patient has essentially become dormant. There are exceptions to this period, such as in the instances of minors whose records must be kept up until the age of 21 years old, or in instances where you have mentally incapacitated persons whose records are required to be kept for the patient's lifetime. Ownership of records is something that we also touched on in the case study, but just to refresh on that, the ownership of the record is with the healthcare provider or the institution who creates that record. So we can provide copies of those records, but in general, we need to make sure that the originals retain with the owner, which is the healthcare provider or the institution. Another aspect that's touched on in the booklet, which is quite important, is the transfer of records. So you have instances where a practitioner decides to close their practice for whatever reason, and there are specific guidelines on what needs to happen in these instances. We also had a question on this from the case study, and we got quite good feedback on that. So essentially, the patients need to be notified in writing within 3 months from the date of closure of the practice. After the closure as well, the patient health records must be retained for a period of 12 months by an identifiable health institution or a health practitioner in order to provide patients with the option of, well, the opportunity to be able to transfer their records over to a new healthcare provider. In the event that a healthcare provider passes away, and if their ownership of the practice is transferred to a new practitioner, then that practitioner has the responsibility, the new practitioner has the responsibility to notify the patients of the change of ownership, and also to provide them with an opportunity to either remain with them or to transfer their records and their healthcare to a new practitioner of their choice. When it comes to access of records, it's accepted that we know that patients have access to their health records, but what we also need to consider is access by third parties. In general, third parties should not be allowed access to patient records unless that patient has given specific consent for that. But there are exceptions. Exceptions include instances where there's a court order that grants that access without the patient's consent, or when it's determined that non-disclosure could actually be a serious threat to public health, and in instances where you have a healthcare provider who is a third party actually needs access to those records of the patients if they are at the receiving end of, for example, an HPCSA complaint, or at the receiving end of a civil summons, for example. They don't necessarily need the patient consent for that. The booklet also touches on guidelines which deal with the signature and identification of the practitioner on official documents, such as your medical certificates and prescriptions. When it comes to the issuing of prescriptions for scheduled medication in schedules 1 to 4, there is permission for that to be issued in typed computer-generated digital formats. But when you have prescriptions for scheduled medication in Schedules 5 and above, then the prescriptions need to be handwritten and the originals would need to be provided to the patient for dispensary at a pharmacy. So now that we've got quite a good overview on key aspects from the HPCSA Booklet 9, I just want to touch on a few areas that we have identified as, assisting practitioners where we see there is particular difficulty with aspects of the record keeping of patients' records. So what we do see where health practitioners run into difficulty is unauthorized access to patient records and inadequate record of informed consent. These two aspects will be touched on shortly in case studies that we will touch on briefly now. And what we also see is incomplete patient records. So practitioners often encounter difficulties when patient records are requested, whether it's requested by the patient, a third party, or if the practitioner themselves actually needs to view their entire patient file, dealing with the management of the patient if they receive an HPCSA complaint or a civil claim. What we find in instances is that the patient file isn't a complete rendition of the management that was provided to the patient. So it could be limited to clinical notes, and they may not necessarily have the supporting documentation with the patient records, like your referral letters, special investigation reports, simply because they have not been correctly retained or just not appropriately documented. So that's something that we do see quite often. Another issue which we see is lack of correspondence records. So we frequently encounter these he said, she said situations where key details of patient interactions are not adequately documented. In cases where you have complaints or legal action, patients may allege that they had expressed concerns, often to nursing staff, who then in turn will document that the practitioner has been informed of the concern. And on the practitioner side, they may have a record that they were contacted, but do not document necessarily what they were contacted about. And in these instances, we see that it leaves some room to undermine the practitioner's position in defending allegations of this nature if they don't have a specific record of the contents of those discussions or the correspondence with the patient concerns. Another area that we see, which was also touched on in the case study that we just completed, which is the incorrect issuing of prescriptions. So as more practices transition to digital systems, we see that it's increasingly common for prescriptions to be issued electronically, either with digital signatures or sometimes handwritten scripts that are actually scanned in and then sent to patients or pharmacies. But as we know, Schedule 5 and higher medications, there are requirements for them to be handwritten and for originals to be given to patients. And we know that this is in place for good reason. For example, to protect patients from, misuse of these Schedule 5 and above medications. And what we do know is that digital or scanned prescriptions carry a bit of a higher risk of forgery or tampering. So it is important to maintain that the Schedule 5 and above are handwritten and originals are given to the patient, just to maintain that integrity, even though we are transitioning to a more digital system. Lastly, something else that we do see is a lack of notification regarding the closure of practice. So more recently, we've observed an increasing number of private sector practitioners who are closing their practice because of immigrating to another country. In many of these cases, patients aren't actually formally informed about the closure of the practice. Instead, the practitioner just keeps their practice email active and monitors it for patient engagement. And the unfortunate side of this is that while patient records are typically retained, there's often no clear structured plan in place for the long-term management of these records. And what we do see is that patients have quite a difficult time obtaining copies of their records when the practitioner has immigrated and they aren't aware of this because of delays in actually getting copies of these records to them. I would like to touch on a case study dealing with lack of consent to access patient records, which is an area that we see that pops up quite frequently. So you've got Mr. A, who contacts the healthcare provider's practice requesting copies of Mrs. B's clinical records and mentions that, you know, Mr. A has consent to access Mrs. B's clinical records. Now, the practitioner recognizes Mr. A as the spouse of Mr. B, who he has seen before at the practice rooms accompanying the patient. So what the practitioner does do is they comply with the request and sends the electronic records through to the requester, Mr. A, the spouse of the patient. But later on, Mrs. B contacts the practitioner and says, look, I haven't actually given Mr. A the consent to access my records. And what happens here is that the practitioner has breached the patient's confidentiality and can be subject to disciplinary and legal consequences because of this. And the lesson or the takeaway from this is that it's important to always verify consent, especially in instances where if written consent is not accompanied by the third party's request. If that written consent isn't given with the request, then the practitioner must verify the consent with the patient directly. Another case study on an area that we've also identified quite a few difficulties that practitioners run into is when it comes to inadequate record of informed consent counseling. So in this case study, we have Miss X, who underwent an elective hysterectomy procedure by Dr. Y. Miss X then sustained an injury to her urethra during the procedure and had to undergo additional surgical treatments and a lengthy post-op stay. Now, Dr. Y explained to Miss X that, you know, an injury to the urethra is a common risk associated with this type of procedure. Dr. Y recalls explaining this risk to the patient preoperatively. However, the patient cannot recall being counseled on this risk and specifically says that if she was aware of this risk, she would not have undergone this approach. She would have elected to undergo a conservative management approach. Dr. Y refers to his records and sees that they do not document that he discussed the common risks with the patient, and the consent form that the patient had signed only makes provision for the nature of the procedure. Now, the outcome here is that as the practitioner recalls counseling the patients on these common risks and knows that it's standard practice, that it's something that the practitioner does with all patients, but now there is an element of difficulty proving that the patient was properly counseled on the risks of the procedure. So the takeaway or the lesson for scenarios such as this would be to encourage practitioners to record the procedure counseling in addition to the extensive verbal counseling that takes place, but to at least make provision in the clinical notes of the counseling that's provided to the patients, and also when there are circumstances where treatment is administered, if the consent form can also make provision for the nature, the risks, and the benefits associated with that treatment that's being provided. Now, when we look at instances where the record-keeping requirements and guidelines are not necessarily met, we have violations of the HPCSA ethical guidelines. There's also violations with National Health Act, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, as well as the Protection of Personal Information Act. And the direct consequences of this is that the practitioner is then open to or susceptible to HPCSA disciplinary proceedings, civil claims from patients, and also professional reputational damage. So if there's anything that can be taken away from this session that I've just spoken about, would be to just document everything. It is difficult to prove that something has happened if it's not recorded or documented. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jamie Lee, for that great talk. Dr. Strawn, I was wondering what you think about us going into the Q&A. There were some questions that were raised there. Would you like to choose one to start with?
Sure, Amy, and good evening, everybody. There are a few questions in Q&A. The first is, if a patient asks for their folder to take to another doctor that is leaving your practice, can you give the folder including all results and summaries, but keep one's personal notes? Or do you need to give a copy of your written notes to the patient? Do they also need to fill out and sign the POPIA form? So if I can have a stab at that one.
Wonderful, please do.
So I think the first thing is it depends on what the patient's asking for. If the patient's asking for all the notes, then you must give all the notes. If you can have a conversation with the patient and say that, look, the notes are fairly sparse, we can do a summary, then they're happy with that, then that's fine, you can do that. But the personal notes that you write, although they are your property, the patient has a right to them. So, you don't have to give them the originals, but if on request, you have to make a copy and give them even your personal notes. That's why in the booklet it says, be careful what you write. Don't make snide remarks or cynical comments or comment on somebody's behavior or a husband's behavior, wife's behavior, partner's behavior in the consultation. So you do need to give them. So POPIA, this kind of scenario doesn't relate to POPIA. POPIA is about protecting the information. When somebody is requesting it, this has got to do with PIA, which is the promotion of access to information. So in this situation, the patient doesn't have to fill in a PIA form because it's clearly stated that the patient has the right to those. So they don't have to come and explain the reasons for them, and there's no way that you can go then have an adjudication of whether you think that is a reasonable request or not. So this is not about that at all. This is just about you have to provide them and you make copies of all the notes. And obviously you can charge a reasonable fee for that. Let me stop there, Amy, and see if somebody else wants to have a stab at that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Strawn. Shlumbi, I know that you spend a lot of time in the trenches. What would you like to add to that? Any other words of wisdom?
No, I really think that Dr. Strawn has covered most of the things that I would say. So I don't want to add anything more.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Strawn, I am noticing a question that's just popped up in the webinar chat, and I'm wondering whether that could be something that you'd like to discuss, raise with the group.
Is that around the SASOG informed consent form, which states all the complications can occur before the meeting?
Correct. And I think it also ties into very nicely what Jamie Lee was also talking about earlier in her presentation.
Yeah, I mean, Amy obviously could answer that too, but I mean, it's really just saying that it doesn't matter what is written on or who's prepared it. So if SASOG's prepared it, you are still the person who is using it. So you need to be comfortable that the information on there is correct and adequate, number one. The second part is that if you are using that form and you have obtained consent from the patient and the patient has signed the form, well, then they can't say they didn't know. But more importantly, you must record in your notes the date and time and sign that this was discussed with the patient. And if you can do that, then in my view, that is adequate. But maybe Jamie Lee wants to add to that.
Jamie Lee.
Yeah, I'm quite comfortable with that answer, Dr. Strawn. Thank you. It's something that we see quite often. I'm familiar with the informed consent form that you're speaking about. So yeah, at the end of the day, the onus is on the practitioner to make sure that whatever is in that form is discussed with the patient, because we often see a counter argument that the patient's like, well, yes, I did sign the form, but no one explained anything to me that's on this form, or the receptionist actually got me to sign the form and the doctor didn't take me through anything. So in order to safeguard yourself in that instance is to revert back to your clinical notes so that you can say, yes, the patient was counseled on this and the consent form was signed. But it obviously does help to know that there is a signed consent form. But as I said, the onus does rest on the practitioner to make sure that the patient has actually been counseled on the contents of that form.
Thank you very much for that input, Jamie Lee. Dr. Strawn, is there another question that you'd like to choose that sits and ties in nicely with this case study and where we are in the webinar?
Yes, I think there's one. So how do I hand over, maybe Alison can take this one. How do I hand over electronic notes, especially if the new practitioner is not going to use the same medical program? Or will the new practitioner be forced to use the same program?
Thank
Oh,
you,
good
Dr.
question, Alison.
So electronic notes need to be able to be reproduced. I called it reproducible. So you print out into a PDF format and you make them available just like you do paper-based notes. And that is what you provide, and that's what you legally are responsible to provide. May I add something to the previous question on the SASOG informed consent, if I may, Amy?
With pleasure, with pleasure.
I did put my finger up, but we moved on. Does that answer the question on the reproducing of electronic notes? They must be printed out and the patient can collect a copy. Or you can, you can choose which way you want to get them, but they get printed out on PDF typically. On the SASOG informed consent, one of the pieces of advice that we always try and give practices that are newly establishing is to have a window of opportunity between, and it's not always possible, I recognize that, but have a window of opportunity between the time of deciding and consenting with the patient to the time of the op with an information leaflet. Because often what happens is patients are anxious when you treat them and they go away and they now have questions which they are really fussing about. If they have something to read and an opportunity to come back and to have a further discussion, it starts to reduce this need of anxiety around, did I actually understand all the complexities involved? It makes for a far better outcome. So we encourage information brochures, information leaflets that you as the healthcare practitioner provides, and not rushing people to theatre. It's not always possible, but if it is, try and give that space.
Thanks, Alison. From a very practical perspective, that was very helpful. Dr. Strawn, I'm wondering if you'd like to take one other question. I can see that there are a few coming through in both the Q&A and the chat. Do you want to choose another one that you think would be relevant at this point?
Yeah, I think there are a number around notes. I mean, there was a question around, if I get a call at 2 a.m., must I record that in the notes? The answer is absolutely. Anything you pay, any dealing with a patient. I'm going to ask Hlombe. Maybe you can have a good stab at this, and Jamie Lee, because this is one of those, the wordings in these kinds of documents that do make us scratch our heads a little. What constitutes a reasonable time to provide the record? The question here says that an insurer had asked for records and they shouted on the screen because it took the doctor more than 3 days to produce a record. Hlombe, do you want to have a go at that?
Normally, the reasonable time, it's driven by why, say, the insurer would be requesting that record. Firstly, if the records are requested because there's a summons on the table and the legal team really wants to respond to that, there are timelines that are prescribed in law that the records or the response must be given. If it's an HPCSA matter, there are also timelines that you want to respond at a certain date and time. So the reasonable time is really dependent on why do you need to get those records. If it's a letter of demand from a lawyer, and at that point it really does not really have enough legally prescribed timelines, then you've got a little bit of flexibility. I think the only thing that we'd always want to ask, practitioners, please keep a lookout on your emails, keep a lookout on your mailboxes, or I don't know if people still receive letters, but I know summons get delivered. Immediately you get that, please ensure that you talk to your insurer because there might be timelines. The worst thing that happens when you receive those requests, you receive them from the doctor only a day or a week before the deadline is there. So it's all about why those records are required.
Thank you, Shlombe. Jamie Lee, do you want to add something to that?
No, I'm happy that that's covered the content. Thanks.
Happy. Okay, beautiful.
Can I
Dr.
just
Straw? Yes,
can I just say
Shlombe, with pleasure.
I think there's one question for me that is a very practical question. And that question is around, now I've handed over my practice to another practitioner with the patient records. And this patient comes in a year later looking for his or her records and they are not found. Whose responsibility is that? Is it me who sold the practice of handed it, or is it the new practitioner? I think an answer to that is a very important one in terms of knowing that if you hand your records to a new practitioner, please have an Excel spreadsheet, have a database or something, I don't know what is called in electronic terms, that you need to ensure that you've got a list of everything that was handed over to them, so that you would know that at the time of you taking over the practice, these are the records that were handed over to you. It's the same thing as if you want to store them at I think there's a question around document warehouse. You want to ensure that you know exactly what you put in there, the date, the name, the file number, so that if they get lost, you know exactly that these are the things that were handed over. Whoever is receiving the records must sign them. And when you give them over, you must also have a signature on them.
Thank you so much, Shlombe. Dr. Strawn?
Yeah, I think there's a batch of questions here. So thanks for picking that one up, Shlombe. That was going to be one of the ones. So the question was very straightforward. Can you outsource to document warehouse for archiving? And obviously the answer is yes, but then you have to take responsibility to make sure what was there, and whoever's holding that, you need to be sure of the security systems. But Jamie Lee, there are a number of questions around medical aids asking for records. Now, I think rather than going into the detail of every single question, I think your answer will cover. A patient comes to you, they obviously have a medical aid, they have a contract with the medical aid, and the medical aid is then looking for records, or they have their own electronic health record system that they look after. Is it legal, and what are our rights with regard to funders asking for records?
Great question. Jamie Lee?
Yeah, so in general, funders can ask for records, but there obviously needs to be patient consent in place first. And then secondly, it's also within certain parameters. So there needs to be a justification for what record is needed and why it's needed. So essentially, for claims verifications, patients generally consent to information that they need for that process. Also for like pre-authorization, and then in certain instances where they just want to do investigations. So yes, they can ask for records. There needs to be patient consent in place, and it also needs to be within certain parameters. So there needs to be a justifiable reason for that. But also with regards to how they are storing and processing, that needs to be compliance on their side because of the confidential and personal nature of that information that's been handed over. But with that being said, that is the responsibility of the medical aid fund, requesting that information, that they're storing it correctly and handling it correctly. But in essence, the general is that they can, but it's limited, and patients need to be aware of what information is being handed over.
Thanks very much, Jamie Lee.
Sorry to jump in. Just to add to that, Jamie Lee.
No problem.
So the response we get from the funders is that you don't actually need to, I don't need to go and get consent from my patient, because the patient had, in the contract that they signed when they took out their medical aid, signed consent that the funder could view the records. Is that correct?
Yeah, so look, what comes down to it is that it's not necessarily what's in the contract or what the patient signed, but the patient still needs to be aware at the end of the day. So I would always safeguard by communicating with the patient and saying, look, your fund has come to me and they've said that they've got consent to access this information. Is this something that you're aware of? There is a signed document here. And if it's not something that they were counseled on previously, or they don't even know that it forms the basis of their contract, that's an important consideration. So we can't be quick to just jump in and take the fund's word essentially to say that it's in terms of the contract. It is always best to have a transparent relationship, just so that there isn't an incident that comes back with the patient's like, I wasn't aware of what I signed. If I was aware, I would have limited that, or would have discussed it with my fund first with specific conditions, so that they don't have full access to everything. So in that instance, I would say that they can include it in the contract, but the patient actually needs to know what they're consenting to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie Lee, and thanks to the panel. I'm going to suggest that we transition to case study number 2. So let me just start sharing here. Shlombe, if I can invite you to read out case study number 2 for us, please.
This is a case where the doctor relocates to a new practice, where she finds out that the storage in the new practice premises actually not enough. She gets her recently IT qualified son to project plan and digitize all the records. Within 6 months of implementing the change from manual to digitization, serious flaws emerged. Numerous patient records were incomplete, some were erroneously merged with others. Several were entirely missing, compromising the clinical continuity and medical legal reliability. The original hard copy files were not securely archived or professionally destroyed, but they were discarded or stored in the doctor's basement at home. And the digitization process was solely managed by doctor's son and his peers with no formal supervision. The doctor was really not involved in this process, and therefore the doctor was just exposed to some ethical, legal, and regulatory risks.
Thank you, Shlombe. Okay, let's test our knowledge. So if you have recently joined us, we're going to have some questions that we'll run through, and a little poll will pop up that you can put your anonymous answer in. So question number 1, did Dr. N act ethically and legally by delegating the digitization of patient records entirely to her son and his peers without formal oversight or safeguards? If not, what was supposed to be her responsibility? So option A is, once a third party has contracted, the responsibility for patient confidentiality and data protection automatically transfers to that third party. B, the practitioner must retain physical copies of all records after digitization, as digitization itself, regardless of the safeguards, can be considered unprofessional conduct. It is unethical and non-compliant with HPCSA and POPIA requirements. Dr. N remains the custodian of patient records and is responsible for ensuring confidentiality, security, proper oversight of third-party service providers, and implementing safeguards against unauthorized access. Or D, while confidentiality remains essential, the practitioner's only responsibility is to ensure the third party signs a confidentiality agreement with no further oversight required. Marcel, can you please put up case study 2, question 1 for us, please? Right, so we'd love you to vote. All answers are anonymous. If you're not seeing the little poll or quiz popping up on your screen, please feel free to put your comment in the chat. I can see those coming through. Beautiful, thank you so much. We'll give you a few more seconds to answer this one. If you're not sure, it's anonymous, so give it a guess. We'd love to see what the audience knows or where your gaps are, and we can help fill those in. All right, a few more seconds. All right. Marcel, if I can ask you to please close the poll for us. Let's see. Okay, so the answer is C, and it's wonderful to see that 88% of the audience is aligned with this. And all right, let's go to question number 2. To what extent has Dr. N failed to meet the ethical and professional standards of accurate, secure, and accessible record keeping as required by the HPCSA? A, the breach arises only because the records were digitized, as the HPCSA does not have a guideline for digitization, and therefore Dr. N could implement the project however she felt was a correct process. B, No professional or ethical breach occurred since the full responsibility for confidentiality automatically transfers to the son because of his technical skill. C, a minor breach only, because while confidentiality and privacy are important, Dr. N regularly receives updates from her son, clearly documented on the son's Excel spreadsheet. Or D, Dr. N failed to meet her ethical duty of confidentiality, custodianship, and proper record keeping, as well as failure to comply with POPIA obligations. Marcel, please can you put up case study 2, question 2 for us? Lovely to see so many answers coming through in the chat already. Right, those answers are coming through. Thank you for contributing. We'll give you a few more seconds to put your answers down. Okay, Marcel, if you'll close the poll for us. Okay, the answer is D, and 95% of you got that correct. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I am going to hand over to Alison. Alison, can I invite you in to share your wisdom on record keeping?
Thank you to EthiQal for this evening's event and for inviting us to join this panel and this discussion. Just to set the context, my experience and opinion shared is based purely on the environment from which I work, which is particularly with establishment and management of specialists in private practice. We have, since 2016, successfully established, I'm very proud to say, 350 specialists in private practice with the help of a very professionally qualified, very big team. And we have worked across a number of hospitals across the country. So what I did was, when I looked at what would make this accessible for everybody and manageable for everybody, was I came up with these R's for record keeping, ethical record keeping. And what I'm trying to do here is convey the principles rather than asking people to try and remember all the rules, because remembering rules is complex and the language of law is complex. Whereas if we all understand the principles involved around record keeping, it is a whole lot more manageable. So it starts with the word that we've heard a lot this evening, and that is responsible. As the healthcare provider treating a patient, you remain responsible. As the business owner, you remain responsible. And as the information officer, whether that information is digital or paper-based, you remain responsible. Unfortunately, it goes further. A lot of specialists in private practice today employ admin and clinical staff, and often clinical associates, and even in some cases, medical officers. And they do this to lower the burden on them of administration. Regardless of all of that, you remain responsible. Secondly, if you outsource any of the functionality around record keeping, please know that responsibility does not transfer to your outsourced service provider. You are responsible for those records, and you will be called upon to account for those records. Importantly, when venturing down the road of electronic systems come with licenses. You, as the business owner, need to be the owner of the license of that software. Often, these programs are sold by service providers who have an additional or an ancillary service to the software, and the license is sometimes kept in their name. If your relationship with that service provider turns sour, you cannot often access your information and your records easily. Please make sure that licenses are in your power to control and provide access to those whom you need to work with in order to use that information. So you remain accountable. A lot of responsibility, but it is where we are at in the modern world. Secondly, please understand that whilst we are using AI technology freely, and most of us aren't even aware that we are using it even in our day-to-day operations, please record everything and check those recordings. In years gone by, the doctor would dictate, the typist would type, and he would check her letters. With AI, you have that same responsibility. While records might be generated, you still have a responsibility to check that what is recorded is accurate for what you have experienced in that situation. Also, what this has enabled is the fact that there's no excuse not to keep comprehensive records of everything. Recoverability. We've had this case study now, which has indicated that the information was not accurately recoverable. When you engage in electronic patient record keeping, you need to make 100% sure that if the system fails, where is it housed? So it needs to be online, accessible, and recoverable when you need it. Many of the specialists we work with are needing to access that information after hours on call. You also need to ensure that the backups that have been explained to you when you first engaged with the system that you're using are actually valid and real and available to you. Do random checks. Ask for this. Make sure that this is so. Some practices have patients that have chronic recurring conditions and they see them regularly, and that would quickly flag that these records aren't easily recoverable. But some other practices see patients, treat them, and the patient moves on. And then in a couple of years' time, the patient comes back, where's the record? Please check, do random checks. Records, we had the question earlier from Dr. Strawn, he raised it. What happens in the case of electronic record keeping? They must be easily reproduced for third-party providers, as well as understanding that patients can ask for their records and they can go and get a second opinion elsewhere. You have to be able to produce those. On the note of reproducing, a word of warning to the wise. If you start with one electronic system, no matter what anybody tells you, please understand that they do not easily translate to other electronic systems. No matter what anybody tells you that the data can go from this system to that system, it does not work. So what might happen is you start with a system, you find it either too costly, too cumbersome, or not user-friendly to your needs. And in wanting now to transfer your patient data, you ask for the information to be transferred. It cannot be done. It'll have to all be either manually recaptured, or you start again and you have paper-based records, which they'll reproduce for you. Please check this. On that note, when working with service providers, please do your research around what suits you. There is nothing wrong with having paper-based records. Absolutely nothing wrong. If that's what your style is and what suits you, then that's what you choose, and you find an electronic billing system that might complement that. If you want an electronic system, test them out. Ask for demonstrations. Talk to colleagues within your own discipline. Some systems have been written particularly for a specific discipline. Others, not so much. Others have a universal coverage. Please do your research, understand the contract, and understand the licensing and the access and control elements of those systems. I cannot stress this point enough. It is not something that doctors that we work with do easily. They talk to a friend who says this, and then they're unhappy 6 months down the line. Do your homework. This is a big decision. It impacts you at the most inconvenient time when you least need it, if you're not happy. Finally, understanding the risks involved in record keeping. Medical systems across the ecosystem of a healthcare relating to the patient are fragmented. The hospital has systems. You have your system. You may have an AI app for recording notes. These are all separate. They're fragmented. You are still responsible for ensuring that that record is comprehensively kept and maintained on the patient file in your practice. Do not at any point think that the notes that you've made in the hospital system belong to you. They do not. They belong to the hospital. You are expected to make your own notes for your own records. If you are hauled up before the HPCSA and your professional indemnity provider comes alongside you and asks for your records, you cannot go scrambling to the hospital for their records. They will defend themselves. You are expected to defend yourself with your records. Please note the final point on record keeping. Your records are the only representation of your care of a patient when you cannot stand up to defend yourself. So ensure that whatever you do in terms of record keeping and whatever your team does and whatever your service providers do aligns with your values of keeping ethical and records of integrity. It will save you so many sleepless nights. Thank you, Amy.
Panelists, I'd love to see you all on camera and welcome you to the panel discussion. There's been some interesting comments coming through. I'm looking at some of the questions that came through from during the registration process. And Alison, you've spoken about record keeping. Dr. Strawn, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on coming back to some of the questions from registration about how long notes should be kept, about why different specialities keep notes for different periods of time, what happens when a patient is incapacitated. I'm wondering if maybe that would be a good place for us to jump in at this point.
Yeah, just wanted to answer one question that came through on the chat about
with pleasure.
Patient wants to go to another doctor and that doctor says, oh man, just send me a summary, don't send me the whole file. So you write the letter and you send it to the doctor and the patient says, but I want a copy of that letter. Can they have that? And the answer is absolutely. Every single communication that you have with anybody about that patient must go into the patient's file. And as such, the patient has a right to that letter. And Alison, I think your point around hospitals using electronic health record systems and doctors recording their notes on that electronic health record system, I mean, it raises a massive problem that we're facing in terms of the interoperability of these systems. But you're right. I mean, it's absolutely essential that whatever you write down, you can't just, if you're in ICU, you can't just write it on the ICU chart. Or if you are going to do that, then at least make a copy of it, scan it on your phone and stick it in your notes or something. You need to do that. Yeah, I think for me, the thing around retention of records is the very first line in the booklet to which Amy Lee referred is correct. You would prefer to keep patient records forever. And the only reason we don't do that is because we are paper-based and the space becomes limited. But ideally, you should be able to, should want to keep it. And those of us who have been in practice long enough, I've been a pediatrician in practice for 30 years, I definitely get requests 15 to 20 years after I saw the patient. We've moved to Australia and we're seeing somebody else, and you saw them when they were 5. Do you have the record still? So that's important. I think in terms of the specialities, I mean, it's really only, when we talk about people who are mentally incapacitated or people with mental health issues, sure, I mean, it refers predominantly to psychiatrists, but we all in our patients see patients who have mental health issues and often counsel them on them. Certainly in GP space, we do physician space, pediatric space, and obviously in the psychiatry space. And in many of these instances, it's because it's a lifelong condition, and the patient is dependent on medication. So you need to have a record of that. In the pediatric space, children after the age of majority, which is 18, they have 3 years in which they can, in their own right, lay a claim for what happened to them during their pediatric years, teenage years. So that's why you need to keep it until they are 21 years of age. And this relates also to anybody who's in obstetric practice, who's seeing somebody under the age of 18 years. I know it says that if it's not possible, you can keep it for 6 years. I would be very, very hard-pressed to think that I've been seeing a patient for 15 years. I've got a file that's as thick as my forearm, and they decide to go to somebody else, and then 6 years later you scrap that file. I don't think that's clever. I think if you're going to scrap a file, maybe it's somebody who saw you once for a minor thing, and it's neither here nor there, and that might be acceptable. But I think generally speaking, the best advice is to try and retain the files for as long as you're possibly able. And if you're running out of space, send them to a document warehouse somewhere. I'd love to hear what Amy Lee's thoughts on my comments are.
Yeah, Jamie Lee.
May I jump in on something?
Sure, Alison. We'll go to Jamie Lee.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say something. Dr. Strachan has raised this a second time, is if we have dealt with practices where these massive amounts of paper files are having to be put into Metrofile. There are 2 things: an index system, not only for what is put in, but for how to find what is there. It's critical. There are so many people who sell practices or who leave the country with, or who retire, or heaven forbid pass on, and someone takes over. We think about patients that are in chronic care, neurology practices, etc., etc., etc. I once had an obstetric gynecology practice, and the patient's files were linked to an electronic system with numbers. How do you find that patient's file? So we have to have index systems in those cases. Does this make sense? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Please make sure that if you have a system like that, if people have to use it, if you're not there, it has to be a representation and people have to be able to access it.
Thanks, Alison. Jamie Lee, do you want to offer some insights from a legal perspective?
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Strachan covered it quite well. So obviously, ideally, you would want to keep them for as long as possible, but there are the minimum requirements, which is the 6 years. But then you would also need to look at the type of treatment you're providing and see if there's any specific requirements for the retention of those records. So, for example, minors, as Dr. Strachan said, you need to keep it at least until the minor reaches the age of majority to age 18, and then allow them that 3-year prescription period until the age of 21. And also mentally incapacitated persons, you would need to keep their records for a lifetime. But as I said, you really need to look at the type of care that's provided and see if there's a specific requirement, because in certain instances, you would be required to keep something for maybe 15 years or 25 years. Honestly, it depends. As I said, the longevity of the treatment that would be provided, a specific condition could be for a long-term basis that requires you to have a history of that treatment in order for the continuity of care, for the best care to be provided. So you really do also need to apply your mind in certain instances, as Dr. Strawn said, that, you know, if you see a patient once off and the nature of that consultation is not necessarily something that would turn on it after those 6 years. So you could, you know, destroy the record in a proper manner after those 6 years. But if you see that the nature of whatever care was provided would be something that a patient would need for a longer period of time, you need to apply your discretion for that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Dr. Strawn, is there another question that you'd like to pick out before we go to case study 3?
Yeah, I wanted to Jamie Lee, what would your recommendation be to an obstetrician around record keeping? Because obviously there's a baby involved, and the obstetrician may in their records, or should have in their records, a note from the attending doctor at the time of the baby's examination. I mean, with the 21, do you think the 21 years is necessary for that too? Or what would you advise?
Yeah, in instances where you've got an obstetrician managing an antenatal patient, and if for some reason something happens to the baby while in utero or during birth, and that it's something that could impact the baby for once it's born, and it's a condition that's lifelong, I would suggest keeping that until the minor does reach the age of 21 years old, just because you can trace back one would say the origin of any of the conditions that that person may have suffered or may be suffering from, whilst obviously no longer being a minor and reaching the age of majority, and then wanting to take any legal action if they do need to. And having those obstetric records to go back to, it's incredibly useful for something like that. So if an obstetrician does run into any antenatal complications or any birth complications, I would definitely be inclined to keeping those records for a longer period of time.
And if a patient dies, how long do you keep the record for?
If a patient passes away, if a patient passes away, I would suspect that when you have the executor who's appointed, because prescription is quite tricky when you have somebody passing away, because we see this quite often where we have obstetric patients specifically who have passed away, and we then see when the summons is issued, and we sort of have to look at the dates from the dates of the incident or when the executor has been appointed. So generally what happens is to bear in mind that yes, there's a 3-year prescription period from when an incident occurs or when somebody gains knowledge of whether or not that incident could be in line with something that could give rise to a claim. But in a patient death, for example, we look at adding an extra year on that 3-year period. So for prescription purposes specifically, if you are looking at instituting a claim arising out of that patient death. So in essence, I would say if it's specifically to institute a claim and we're looking at prescription, it would be 4 years as opposed to 3. But that being said, I would still err on more of a conservative side because prescription can be so tricky. I would keep them longer.
Okay, and then there was a question around when you receive reports from other people, so you receive a report from an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, do you have to keep them? And again, the point is, if you've received them and you've included them in the patient's file, that becomes part of the patient's file, and you need to keep them. And that's simple as that. If you've received them and included them, then you need to keep them. Amy, I think you can take it from there.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. All right, let us go back into our case study 3. Shlombi, I'm going to call on you, please. Let me just go over here. All right, just waiting for my... Okay. Shlombi, over to you, please, if you'll read case study 3.
Right, thank you. The case study 3, Dr. A transitions from paper to electronic records. scanning, uploading files to the cloud without consulting IT security experts. The original paper records were shredded, and system access was shared by a single password between Dr. A and his receptionist. Dr. A stored a backup of all patient records on his personal laptop, which was stolen from his car. And those records had access, unauthorized access, or people had unauthorized access to those records. Following the theft, some patients began receiving suspicious calls referencing their medical information. One patient discovered her confidential psychiatric notes had been publicly posted online. Dr. A now faces a professional crisis involving potential violations of data protection laws, ethics, and regulatory standards.
Thank you, Shlombe. All right. So let's get into our 2 questions. So what specific breaches of confidentiality and data security are evident in Dr. A's handling of these patient records? A, Dr. A only breached the confidentiality slightly because cloud storage is generally secure and the laptop theft was an unpredictable event. B, Dr. A breached patient confidentiality and data security by failing to encrypt sensitive records, sharing passwords, not vetting cloud security, and storing unencrypted backups on a portable device. C, no breach occurred because the records were uploaded to the cloud and shredded so the information remained safe. Or D, the primary breach was shredding the paper records before confirming cloud upload. Everything else was acceptable. Marcel, can you please share case study 3, question 1? Wonderful. So for those of you who joined us, have recently joined us, if you're seeing the poll pop up, please put your anonymous vote on the poll so that we can see that. If the poll is not popping up for you, please feel free to pop your answer in the chat so that you can still participate. Lovely, I'm starting to see the chat answers coming through. That's great. We really appreciate your participation. All right, we'll give you a few more seconds to vote. All right. Okay, Marcel, if you'll close the poll for us, please. Okay, the answer is B, and 91% of you got that correct. So he breached confidentiality. All right, question number 2, last one for the case studies tonight. So how does POPIA apply to this case? A, Dr. A violated POPIA by failing to implement adequate technical and organizational safeguards to protect personal information, sharing login credentials and storing unencrypted backups on a portable device, failure to notify patients and the regulators of the data breach and demonstrating to them that he was doing everything reasonable to secure systems. Or B, the only POPIA concern was shredding the paper files since the law mainly protects physical records, not digital ones. Or C, POPIA does not apply to Dr. A as he's a private practitioner and not part of a government entity. Or D, Dr. A complied with POPIA since he stored the records in the cloud, which is considered secure under normal circumstances. Marcel, can I please have question 2 for case study 3? Wonderful. If you'll please vote. This is your last opportunity to vote in a poll tonight. So if you haven't and you haven't felt brave enough, share your anonymous answer. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, I'm seeing some answers coming through in the chat. Thank you so much for participating. Okay, wonderful. 95% of you got the right answer, and that was A. Okay, I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Dominic White, who is our ethical cyber hacker, to share some information with us. Dominic, if you'd like to share your presentation, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. While I'm putting the presentation up, first, it's fairly obvious I don't come from your world. I think all of you are medical practitioners and have a shared context. I come from the world of cybersecurity. And, it's great to see right at the beginning that the majority of you were, a combination of wanted to learn more about cybersecurity, but were scared by it. And I think that's what I want to try and help you with a little tonight. So turns out Copilot is now built into PowerPoint, can generate slides for you. So I asked it, what should health practitioners do? and it produced this. And this is what you see all of the time whenever cybersecurity people speak to you. It gets boiled down to a list of things that you're supposed to do. And there's not really a lot of context around it. You're not maybe always sure why you want to do it. So there was a great question in the chat about using Dropbox and the subtlety of, well, if your laptop gets stolen and you're using Dropbox, are the files unencrypted and available on your machine? It doesn't come through here. So you're using backups and you might have secure authentication, but there could still be a significant chink in the armor that could land you in exactly the case study that we just did. So I don't think these sorts of things are useful. And if you want them, you can literally ask ChatGPT for them. Instead, I want to talk to you about pianos. And what I mean by pianos is I think we all have an ability to naturally assess the risks we face and to make smart decisions if we understand those risks. And so what I'm talking about with pianos is if you have to meet somebody in a bad neighborhood in the middle of the night to pick up a Schedule 5 subscription, and your greatest concern was that a piano would fall on your head, then you've misunderstood the risks. You've misunderstood that actually you've got a high risk of getting mugged or getting hijacked. You know, those are the real risks in those situations. And you don't need to be a physical security expert to understand that, or to know, let me meet them somewhere else, or do it during the day, or bring a bodyguard, or a stab-proof vest, or, you know, whatever needs to be required. So what I want to very briefly show you is, you know, what does it look like when you get attacked, cyber hacked in South Africa? That's not a comprehensive case study, but it's a brief view. So this is increasingly what's happening to most people. So this was the example of the controls that I think you can, that maybe aren't really useful to you. And here I was talking about pianos. Let's just do that video again. So somebody sitting on their phone and somebody grabs it out of their hand. This is very common in South Africa. And the reason they're doing that is they want to get access to your phone because it's a gateway to everything else. And they want to get access to it while it's unlocked. So you might have a PIN code on your phone, or Face ID or Touch ID or something like that. But if they can grab it like this, then they get it unlocked. If they can't get it when it's unlocked, then you often, one of your loved ones gets a message like this. This is an actual screenshot from a real victim after being mugged. Her husband got this message. It says his wife's name. It describes the iPhone that was stolen. They're a very trusting couple, so he knew her PIN code and could log in. And then he saw a picture like this. This is actually where they contacted me to say there's something wrong with Apple's Find My iPhone. At which point I realized they'd been phished. They'd been tricked into giving up the PIN code. So now the attackers can log in to the device. Why do the attackers want to log into the device? Because from there they can access your email. From there they can access your Uber Eats or your PayPal, whatever medical record keeping you might have on your phone. People were talking about taking photographs of patient notes on your phone, all of those sorts of things. But for the most part, criminals are not trying to get access to your patient notes. And I know there's a heavy compliance focus on all of these things, but for the most part, they're trying to get access to your money. They're trying to get access to your bank accounts. And so the first thing they'll do is see if they can get access to your bank accounts. If you've saved your password for your bank accounts in your browser's secure password storage, they now have your code to unlock your phone and gain access to those. So they can log into your bank. And it doesn't matter if you are early in your practice and you have no money, they will open overdrafts in your name. They know how to get money out very quickly. Once they've done all of that, they will order Uber Eats orders of food. I mean, they will try and monetize this in every way they can. Another common attack, something called business email compromise. It's a very fancy name for somebody gained access to your email and is now messing with payments. So how do they do that? You might get an innocuous looking email like this. And when you click on it to open it, you get a very helpful prompt. This is taken from an actual phishing site. And the only difference in this URL at the top between the real one and the bad one is that there's a dash there instead of a dot. So it's very difficult, you know, on the high end, it can be difficult to spot whether these are valid or not. You helpfully sign in using your Google details, unaware that this is an attack. And maybe you have two-factor authentication. You've set up your phone to receive an SMS or a one-time code that you pop through. So there you get your code from Google. Well, they'll make sure to ask for that code too, so that they can log into your email. Then what do they do once they log into your email? They're looking for payment instructions. They'll set up rules to forward things to attackers. So if you're making a payment, a down payment on a house or a car, or maybe you're buying some expensive medical equipment for your practice and need to make some payments, They will intercept the email that has the bank account details where you need to make that payment to. And a lot of the time they'll add fake proof of bank details on there too, or even legitimate ones because they're adding their own ones. People think things like PDFs are proof of authenticity. They aren't. Here I've modified one. Can you tell the difference between the real one and the fake one? Not really. And so this is one of the most prolific attacks worldwide. This is costing billions. And it's a real concern. So that's what it looks like when you kind of get hacked these days. Those are some of the most, if you're in South Africa and you're online, you'll experience one of those, or a colleague will experience one of those, and it can be quite terrifying, and it can lead to some real risk. So if you take time to understand how the attacks work, you can start to imagine how those defenses need to apply in your environment. Now, there's not enough time to have a proper comprehensive conversation about that. Maybe we can do some of it in the questions. But imagine what would happen if somebody physically stole your laptop or broke into your practice and stole the receptionist's desktop. If somebody if you used the same password for a site that gets breached as you do to log into Dropbox or wherever else you happen to be storing your medical records, what would that mean? So if you think that through, you can start to put some reasonable defenses in place to defend against it. There's also lots of information online. Once you have the hypothesis, this is what I'm worried about somebody doing, how can I protect this? That's where you can empower yourself to find more information specific to your situation. So I don't want to give you a list of just do these 5 simple things and you'll be secure. I just really want to encourage you that you have a lot more ability to understand how to defend yourself than you think. Just like you're able to defend your home with electric fences and alarms, even though you're not a physical security practitioner, you can also defend your practice in the cyber realm, and it doesn't all have to be dark magic. Okay, that is my very brief contribution.
Thank you, Dominic. That was so helpful. Panelists, can I welcome you back to the discussion if you'd like to put your cameras on? Lovely. Welcome back. Welcome back. Okay, so what should we touch on first? Shlombe, I can see you off mic. You are eager.
Yeah.
How can we start with you?
I think the first question that I just have really for maybe Jamie and Dominic or Alison. You know, doctors would have a WhatsApp group where, you know, I just want to get opinion from, you know, my other colleagues. And I work and I've got this condition or something that I quickly want somebody to respond to. What are the risks that are associated with that? How do doctors protect themselves from asking, or what is it
Can
that
I suggest Alison takes that one, because we literally had a call about it before in preparation for the session.
Very kind man throwing me under the bus here. Thank you, Dominic. I phoned Dominic because I saw these questions coming this afternoon, and I phoned Dominic, I said, now, what is your view on this? Because our perspective is the following. The visibility perspective is, remember, social media is for social. So please refrain from using it to engage with patients, because it leads you down a rabbit hole that often you cannot walk back to a professional relationship with. So that's the first thing. Correspondence, Slombi, between doctors with other doctors. Dominic has assured me that WhatsApp has end-to-end encryption of the messages that they share with each other. We can't regulate or control the way people talk to one another. But from a record-keeping point of view, my suggestion would be, make a little note. I consulted with several colleagues, and if you want to, and they're comfortable, use their names and keep that in your record of what you did. Often we hear about HPCSA cases where someone asks, did you consult a colleague? There's your record. You might not have a way of backing up your WhatsApps. A lot of people do nowadays back up their WhatsApps. But you might not have, but if you've made that little record, you've got your record of having consulted with a colleague, which, by the way, is a good thing. Does that answer, Flamby?
Partly, yes.
Okay,
Partly.
Jamie Lee
What did I
from the
miss?
legal side.
I actually have a question for Dominic from an IT side. So obviously, we can't stop people from communicating freely. We understand that WhatsApp is an easy mode of communication for many people, be it doctor-patient, doctor to doctor, and oftentimes you're using your personal device and not a business line. My question comes in when I understand that WhatsApp has an end-to-end encryption. My limited understanding of this would mean it's information in transit, information that's being passed on as it's being protected as it's being passed on. But what happens when you're backing up your WhatsApp chat history? Where are you backing it up to? It's got sensitive information on there. So if you are going to be using WhatsApp, and if you are choosing a backup option, are we backing it up to a secure server, a secure cloud? Is that encrypted where we're backing it up? So I feel like you could sort of safeguard yourself if you are using WhatsApp, if you are storing the information on a secure, encrypted, properly backed up space. But if not, then I think that's where the concern would come in, that if you're not doing that, then there may be a risk of exposure, and then you're not being compliant with POPIA.
So I think the way to think about sort of encryption and things like that is to not think about encryption, but to think about practically what can you do. So if somebody snatches the phone out of your hand, is able to get the PIN code, they can access your WhatsApps.
Yeah.
If it's backed up into the secure Google Cloud, but somebody is, once again, with access to your phone, or maybe able to compromise your email address and get your password, able to log into your Google account and then gain access to it, it doesn't matter that it's encrypted if people can access it. Because at some point, encryption is designed such that somebody can access it. So what is the access method that encryption uses? So I'm not, I think if people get robbed, there's a risk of disclosure. We can take reasonable methods to secure against it. And honestly, if it's being stored in Apple or Google's iCloud, you've got a reasonable password stored on there, and you have a terrible event where you're mugged, you're held up in your house and forced to give over your passwords. These are real situations that happen. I can't imagine you being found at fault from a POPIA level. So you can't stop real criminals from putting things in place to get around the actual defenses. For example, one of the problems that banks have right now is if they make it too secure to access your bank account, then kidnapping risk increases because, well, now you need to physically be there while they drain your bank accounts. And so we've seen a rise in what we call express kidnappings. So I'm not answering your question. The first part is really just, if you can access it, someone else can access it using it the same way. Apply your mind to it without needing to get into the weeds of what encryption is. I think it is important to note WhatsApp is more secure than email, and certainly more secure than SMS, in that people cannot intercept it. So the disclosure of an active to somebody who's monitoring those channels. I think most of us aren't being monitored by the SSA to try and intercept health information, but if any of you are responsible for the care of high-profile individuals or politically exposed individuals or things like that, then maybe that's more of a risk from your end. But this is talking about the very niche thing of cybersecurity risks. I think all of you have much better understanding of the practicality of how does that constitute doctor notes and record storage. And if somebody's deleting messages, and it's possible to delete messages, I don't think it lets you store your messages. So there's all sorts of practical notes there, which are then outside the remit of cybersecurity.
Thank you very much. Dr. Strawn, do you want to add a perspective? Have you seen anything happening in your community?
Well, I mean, honestly, if you are not in WhatsApp communication with your patients in this day and age, they're going to find somebody who is. In my practice, we run a business WhatsApp for all our patients. They contact us all the time. We run it between 8 in the morning and 8 at night, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. And we have thousands and thousands and thousands. And it's on the laptop and it's password protected. And I think that Dominic's point is absolutely right, is that if somebody comes and steals it, you're in trouble if they can get into it. So I hear all the stories about the legal risks of that, but the reality of it is You know, if a patient reaches out to me on WhatsApp, it's almost like I'm going, well, okay, now we have a line of communication. I will talk to the patient and deal with it, and hopefully the end-to-end encrypted works, rightly or wrongly. That's what's happening all the time.
Anything else from your side, Shlumbi, that maybe you've seen? Ooh, have you frozen, Shlumbi?
We've seen at the beginning. We've seen at the beginning that a lot of our attendees, you know, some of them, they are scared, some of them are looking forward. From a risk point of view, you know, maybe Jamie Lee, do you have cases of people that had hacked or, you know, cyber crime that needed to pay millions and they needed to have cover or something like that? For instance, I'm afraid if I'm transitioning, I could lose everything and I could be sued by whoever because I've lost the records. Do you have some kind of cover, or how much money do people have to look after when they, you know, if a disaster like that happens?
Jamie Lee?
Shlombe, sorry, just a bit of clarity on your question. Are you talking about more so what needs to be put into place in order to safeguard oneself in a situation like that, or you know, how to handle a situation if a situation arises?
For instance, you know, a lot of doctors would have cover, the cover that we provide, for instance.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Because they know that if you injure a patient and, you know, there is a legal,
right,
you know, I mean, someone would tell you that they don't have money, doctors don't have money like lawyers do.
Yeah.
So then is there cover, or is there cases where you know of where it was maybe a person was sued because information was lost or due to cyber security breaches? Is there something like that?
Yeah. So from a protection perspective, because it does happen, you do get cyber risk insurance. But what I can say is that from the incidents that we've heard, because we often communicate quite closely with a firm that specializes in cyber risk attacks, and it's something that I think Dominique has echoed. It's generally towards billing and access to that sort of information, and not necessarily to leak confidential information. But what we do see that also happens is possibly also sort of blocking any digital service to make it difficult for practitioners to be able to access their patient records or their systems, and it impacts their day-to-day operations. So that's something more that we would see, as opposed to there being a threat to disclose the information. It's more so, I'm freezing your entire system and you basically can't treat your patients effectively and run your practice effectively. And that in itself does have a lot of repercussions. But from a protection perspective, as you've mentioned, that, you know, doctors don't just have an unlimited amount of money on hand to be able to pay into a ransom. You do get cyber risk insurance, and in instances like that, they would reach out to somebody like Dominique to assist in that regard when it comes to ransom of software as opposed to a ransom of a person, to see if you're able to actually, you know, gain access back into your system before how would I say, succumbing to any ransom payments. But I would like to defer that to Dominic, because I think he has a bit more of a step-by-step of how to deal with ransom attacks to your systems.
Yeah, so
right, over to you, Dominic.
Sorry, Amy.
No problem.
They don't really care about the medical data, but they care that you care about it being released. So they will try and extort you. So the proper name for ransomware is cyber extortion. So they will extort you for access to your systems or access to your information, or to prevent the leak of the information. It's not uncommon to get double extortion events. We've even seen triple extortion events from different groups. If you do pay the ransom, you sort of get put on lists of somebody who can be shaken down. And sometimes you get re-attacked by other criminals. That certainly happens in the higher end. So they're really trying to make money from it. Absolutely heartless. We've seen some of the negotiations. People's lives are on the line. They don't care. They want their money. Ironically, if they get access to your insurance policy, then they use that in the negotiation because they know that how much you're insured for and how much you're then able to pay. So I'm not saying don't take insurance, but please protect your policy so they don't necessarily know about it. But the best defense against ransomware is not getting attacked. We saw around 200 ransomware incidents in South Africa last year. That's across the board. That includes things like the spectacular NHIS breach, spectacularly terrible to be clear, and as well as smaller incidents. So it's not uncommon in South Africa, but business email compromise numbers the tens of thousands of acknowledged incidents. So it's less common, but they'll make their money where they can. That's a business where they go after as many people as they can. Yeah.
Thank you, Dominic. That was really helpful. So I'm noticing the time, and we've gone 2 or 3 minutes over, and we'd like to acknowledge everyone's time away from family or needing to wrap up. So Dr. Strawn, can I invite you to offer some key messages before I wrap up from a last logistics perspective? Thank you.
Thanks, Abe. I will do that. I wanted to just touch on one question that's popped up on both.
With pleasure.
And it's really around, and Alison, maybe you can take this one. So if a doctor takes a photo of his notes on a hospital system for records, does that not constitute a breach of IP? And how must that doctor keep notes for his records? And how does the doctor record the patient details since it belongs to the hospital?
So firstly, the doctor is treating the patient in the hospital. The patient is under his care as the primary physician, whether it's a surgeon or whatever, he's the primary physician. They are his notes that he is writing, therefore they do belong to him. The point is he must keep his own record of them. The breach is not if he's writing them, it's if somebody else takes a picture of his notes. So whoever makes the note is the note maker, is the owner of the note. If he wants to keep a note of that, it's his prerogative on how he keeps that note. Yes, some people do take photographs of the notes they make, and then they go and transcribe them into their own note system back in their practice. I think that kind of answers the question. The hospital's notes on their system belong to them, but he is also the owner of what has been written there. It's not, when we treat patients, we often forget that we are part of a big team of people. We don't own patients. We are privileged to serve our patients and treat them. And our care has to be documented properly and ethically. Our documentation belongs to us. I think that kind of covers it.
Yeah, I think it's a very good answer. Thank you. I agree completely.
Thanks, Alison. Over to you, Dr. Strawn.
Yeah. So to wrap it up, I think the important thing here is that when we're dealing with patients' records, patients' notes, we have to understand the HPCSA ethical guidelines, but we also need to understand POPIA, and we need to understand what PIA is about. So we really then need to inform ourselves, and there are lots of resources for that. Somebody asked about, if you're sending scripts, do you have to have a password protected? You absolutely have to have them password protected. In fact, you're supposed to have authenticated signatures. The way that we do it these days, where you just sign it, scan it, send it, that's not a legal script. So there's so much at the moment that we as doctors and healthcare professionals have to abide by, even though we understand that in 5 years from now, things are going to be very different. At the moment, the regulation is a regulation. And what we've heard this evening is that be very, very deliberate in the way that you take notes, the way that you record notes, the way that you time them, sign them, hold them, and keep them. Be very deliberate in how you secure them. And Dominic's point is basically if you're using all of the cloud storage and you've got password protected and dual authentication, the risk is far more to you being broken into and having something stolen or having your cell phone ripped out of your hand. So if you look at what Poppier says, Poppier gives you very clear direction on how the site where your notes are stored, whether it's paper or electronic, how that needs to be protected, how you need to inform your staff and make sure that they are properly trained in how to protect that information. And then obviously in terms of retention of records and how we transfer those records once we're not able to practice any longer is again very clear in the booklet. So my take on tonight is we have a wealth of information from some excellent speakers. And our thanks to EthiQal for putting this together. It's been really superb. But the responsibility, as always, falls on us. We must make sure that the information that is in our hands and that what we produce, that we look after properly. And the only way we really know that, apart from attending webinars like this, is by reading Booklet 9, reading Poppier and Paya, and making sure that we are compliant with those regulations. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Strawn. So let me just share my last slide quickly here as we wrap up. So from my side, as your host tonight, thank you all to the faculty. You all came with such rich, diverse perspectives and really shared your wisdom and experience. Thank you too to the audience for joining us tonight, participating and sharing your questions. It was wonderful to host you. When you log off the webinar, there will be an evaluation form. Please share your feedback. It's anonymous. We'd love to hear from you. What do you enjoy? What would you change? What would you like to hear from us? You will each get a CPD certificate for you as your record, but we will also submit your HPCSA professional registration number to the HPCSA to automatically load your points. Just give it about 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes there's quite a backlog, and even though we're in the queue, we just need to wait. And for those of you who would like to watch this again or share it with your colleagues, there will be a recording available from the 15th of October on the EthiQal website. The link will be shared when your email comes with your CPD certificate. So from my side, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to host you. We will be hosting another webinar in November, the date and time to be confirmed. And obviously topic, but we look forward to hosting you there. So good evening and have a wonderful rest of your week.